Let me just take this opportunity to say thank you to all of you for coming along and welcome. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Thushara Dibley, Deputy Director of the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre. And for those of you who've not encountered the centre before, we're a cross-faculty centre here at the University of Sydney, and we coordinate the university's activities around Southeast Asia. And we also do organise activities like this, which bring together people with a common interest in the region. So tonight's event is really about the book, but I also thought it was a really good opportunity to bring together practitioners who are based in Sydney, who have an interest in Southeast Asia, with our academics who do work in the region, and with students. One of the things that our centre really prides itself on is having quite a number of our members who are very actively engaged in hands-on work in the region. So I'm hoping that, and I think there's a lot of synergy between what our academics do and what people like Archie and Mark do through the NGOs that they work for. So I'm hoping that today will be the first of many events which bring together practitioners and academics and our students as well, who are interested in working in and learning more about the countries to our north. So the book is one way I thought to start building those links. It's about NGO partnerships, specifically partnerships between international and local NGOs involved in peacebuilding work in Timor-Leste and in Aceh in Indonesia. So the book maps out 3 different styles of NGO partnership and looks at the way ideas about peace were exchanged between the different organizations that were working together. And also looks at the dynamics of power between these different institutions and how those dynamics influenced the way that ideas were developed and also the way those ideas were then later on implemented. For me, this particular project it was important that the outcomes of this research were relevant beyond just the walls of the university. I started working on this research after a little over a year of volunteer work in East Timor, in Timor with AFIDA. Peter, thanks very much for coming. An organisation that really prides itself on developing long-standing and close relationships with its local partners. And it was through working with AFIDA that I really learned to value the practice of partnership. And I left Timor feeling quite certain that whatever research I did, I sort of wanted to explore this idea a little bit more. And it was also particularly important to me that whatever research I produced was useful not only to scholars of development and NGOs and students of those fields, but also to practitioners. So I was very pleased a few weeks ago when I got the hard copy of the book in my hand to discover, and made a few phone calls, to discover that there still remains an interest amongst NGOs here in Sydney in this concept of partnership. And when you work on a project like this, I started it 7 years ago. Partnership is a question that's been around for a very long time, so I just wasn't quite sure whether it was still relevant to practitioners today. So I was very, very pleased that both Archie and Mark were interested and available to participate in this discussion tonight. So I'll just introduce our guests. Mark McPeak joined ChildFund Australia as the International Program Director in 2009, and he manages programs in Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, PNG and Vietnam, and he oversees partner relations in East Africa and Southeast Asia. And he's had a very long career in the non-government sector, both in the US and around the world. Archie Law is the CEO of ActionAid, and he's been involved in development work for over 2 decades. Starting off in Cambodia, then working with World Vision in their emergency team, and before starting with ActionAid here in Sydney in 2007, he worked for the UN in New York and in Africa. So we'll have 2 experts, really, on NGO partnership. These guys are working on partnerships on a day-to-day basis. So the way I thought we'd run this evening is I've come up with some questions that reflect the theme of the book. They've both been given a copy of the book. I was going to get them both to talk about it, but I know they're very busy people and I wasn't 100% sure if they'd have time to read it. So we'll We'll start off with a few questions, and then I think that they also have questions for each other. We've been developing some tough questions for each other.
How tall are you, Archie?
And then we'll open up to the floor for anyone else who's interested. And I'll just get you guys to use the microphones.
Sure.
So maybe before, just to kick off, could you guys maybe talk a little bit briefly about the types of partnership your NGOs are involved in?
Yeah, firstly, congratulations on the launch of the book too. It's a terrific achievement, and I would gleefully admit I didn't read the whole book, but quite proud that I read some of it. I certainly got to a conclusion and bits and pieces, and yeah, I don't know, it's just the size of the reading pile is something I never get on top of, but well, congratulations. I'm really happy too that this book is out there, because the whole issue of partnership has been around forever and will be around forever, and it's something that we've obviously put a lot of work into over the years and continue to. Just thinking within the region, some of the countries we work in, such as Myanmar and Cambodia, particularly, where different contexts really demanding a different sort of partnership. But at the same time, we do have, and I'm sure ChildFund is the same, as far as we have an overarching international partnership manual, really, which guides how we work with local partners. So we do need, I suppose, a coherence when it comes to values, when it comes to mutual respect, equity, accountability, at the top end, if you like, because if that's not there, it's very difficult for any sort of partnership to flourish. I can get into some more on, say, the mechanics and the machinery, but just say in the two countries we're working in, which again are both post-conflict countries. Cambodia is interesting because it's a mix depending on what we want to be doing. We work with a local NGO in the south of Cambodia, just sort of picking on things that I've visited, where there's a strong focus on education, strong focus on women smallholder farmers and livelihoods work there, and it's a local NGO implementing that work with communities. We do similar work in the north, but then when we get into Phnom Penh, we're increasingly working with social movements. We're doing a lot of work at the moment with garment workers in Phnom Penh, who people will know are at the centre of the protests. Some incredibly brave people that you come across there. So, directly supporting movements where we do share those values, we share goals, but it's done in a different way, and it demands a different sort of partnership to the one that you'd use with a local NGO. It's a lot looser, if you like. We can get into a little bit more about that as we go along. Myanmar, we've adopted a completely different model. In Myanmar, we work directly with communities. We have a fellows program in Myanmar where people are selected from their villages, young people, usually under 25. They come in with us. We train people for 6 months in community development, methodologies, techniques. They go back to their community. They come up, work with the community to assess the challenges and the problems facing that community. Then they come up with a roadmap of where that community is going to go to pursue its dreams. We have, I think at the latest count, we have 800 fellows working in Myanmar now, so we're working in 800 communities, and it's very much community-based work. And some of those communities have actually, in a sense, local organisations have spun out of those communities. So there are some CBOs that have actually arisen from the organisation that's taken place, and it's been fairly organic. But at the same time, there are different partnerships there because our role is more of a catalyst in that sort of area. But if there's a need for hardware, whether it's drilling wells or whether it's specific technical advice around agriculture, we'll partner with a local or an international NGO to provide that input. So yeah, sort of different approaches depending on context.
Right, and so how different is the model of partnership with ChildFund? It sounds like ActionAid have different styles, different types of organisations and different models. Is it the same with ChildFund? Do you have a more standard approach?
Pretty similar. Firstly, thanks for the invitation, and enjoyed about half of the book I was able to get through. Like Archie, did pretty well with that, I think, and enjoyed it a lot. I think it's an important book with a lot to offer practitioners. There seems to be a whole lot about partnership in the research world, but when you actually look for specifics about what works in what kinds of situations, in this particular case, peacebuilding, we don't find it enough. Some similarities to Archie's story. I want to talk a little bit about two organizations. Firstly, ChildFund, where I am now. Our current partnerships tend to be very nuanced depending on the context and the purpose. Our organization's mission is not about partnership, it's about children. So partnership is a means, and it's a means towards sustainability and longer impact, of course. But because it's a means, it's something that we think through depending on the context of the work we do. In Laos and Vietnam, our work tends to be with local government. We refer to them as partners. Of course, the power dynamics are interesting in that situation in those countries, and I think healthy in some ways, because the international NGO is not at the huge advantage that they find themselves in other cases. In Cambodia, also we work in local partnership with local government, but increasingly with local civil society also. That's an area of growth for us. In Myanmar, as Archie said, we are working only through local civil society. It seems to be the best way to work there. Interestingly, in two of our local partners in Myanmar, we're benefiting from the investment of other international NGOs, including ActionAid. So we're now partnering with two organizations that have emerged from the Fellows program that Archie's talking about. And similarly with another agency that ChildFund has brought up and helped nurture through a number of years, and we're partnering with them now. So depending on the circumstances, a different kind of partnership, depending on the local context. The other organization that I worked for previously is actually mentioned in the book, which was a bit of a surprise, and fairly positively. And that's an organization, UUSC, where I was before, which works only in these partnerships and works more because that organization is not officially present in countries, does not have the restrictions that ChildFund or ActionAid has of being a registered international NGO. We were able to be in that organization a little more adventurous about the kind of partnerships we were able to do in the activist area. One other thing about your framework, if I could mention, that I really liked. Thushara's book talks about a framework of three kinds of partnerships, just simplifying. Contractual partnerships, partner-driven relationships, and network partnerships. In our industry, often you'll find people putting down contractual partnerships as somehow not real partnerships. And I think they can be real partnerships, and they're just defined in a different way, and the same principles of respect and mutual accountability can apply. Partner-driven relationships have been like in the 90s, and the Alan Fowler sort of authentic partnership speak has been like the Holy Grail. This was the dream, the ideal, and I really think we need to be more realistic about that, and maybe we can talk about that later. And to be just slightly provocative, I really think the world is moving towards networked partnerships much more than the traditional sort of INGO partnerships with local civil society, thinking and dreaming about these authentic relationships which are going to be sustainable. That works sometimes. But I really think in today's world, networks of mutual influence are going to be much more the way that the world goes.
So with so just bouncing off that idea, the network relationship that I looked at in the book was the International Centre for Transitional Justice, and they ran a really similar model. Unlike many of the other NGOs, they actually ran a very similar model in these two different places, in East Timor and Aceh. Basically, what they did was they didn't directly fund the local NGOs they were working with. The local NGOs had to find their own funding, but they worked together on projects of shared interest. Now, what worked, I thought, for that particular one, was there was a person who had built these relationships with the local NGOs, and she was able to leverage those personal relationships. There's some points where one meeting I was at where we were sitting down and the UN was there, and they were trying to influence the agenda of a meeting, and one of the local NGO leaders came up and told them what was going on, and he was like, no way, you guys are not going to be involved in this meeting. She leaned over and said, that's my husband. I told him last night what he had to do. So she didn't have the same influence in East Timor as she did in Aceh as she did in East Timor, and so the network worked quite differently. So I'm interested in your experience with these different partnership models that you work with. How much do the individual people who are responsible for managing those relationships and partnerships and selecting the fellows, what role does that have? To what extent does the structure of a partnership override the role of the people who are involved, or vice versa?
My own experience in both of those environments is that it has almost nothing to do with the structure. It's all about the relationships and the continuity of relationships. That's my experience. And for good or for bad. And where international NGOs, in my experience, have gone the wrong direction, it has often been turnover of the person in the international NGO who has been the point person or the relationship manager. We move too often, those relationships change, and that spells the end of, or that's the road towards the end of many of those relationships. So great contracts, great principles of shared power and mutual decision-making and influence, and even shared boards and decision-making, governance. All that's good, but it won't work if there's a lot of turnover and of the relationship. And I could give lots of examples of that. The best ones have been, believe it or not, the best ones I've seen have been decade or more of continuity on the side of the international NGO or the network, the lead, and then like the transitional justice or the network, a decade or more. And that's hard to do in our organizations.
Yeah, I think structure is important. I think structure, when it creates platforms for engagement, is particularly important. I just think of some of the work we do as far as, like many others too, it's not unique to us, but some of the tools for accountability, such as social audits, such as transparency boards, such as annual review, reflection processes, where we get challenged. I've seen us challenged in some contexts in Bangladesh where we've been hit really hard, and you've got to be ready to take it as well and listen and learn. And I think I think you need that sort of platform probably rather than a structure, because the structure sort of implies to me something a little rigid almost. But to have that platform where the engagement can take place. But I agree with Mark as well that it is the relationships, and it's a matter of who's working for both organisations actually, or the number of organisations who are in that partnership. I'm not so sure that international staff are best placed often to be near those conversations too much. I think I'm just sort of thinking about the two examples I gave where we have internationals as country directors, one in Bangladeshi, Myanmar, the other a Brit in Cambodia. But their roles are more of almost an advisory, guiding, mentoring type role with national staff. And there are different depths of relationships formed when you come from the same place and you're all there for the long haul. And I'd be a bit critical of some organisations when you can see really top-heavy international presence And that's, you know, that's when you do get people get 2 years here, 3 years there, and hop on to the next place.
I'll just cut in there.
Yeah.
So just with the
You got that one?
yeah, I got my own. with this idea of continuity and having local people mediate those relationships, I agree. I think sometimes that can work really well. But there are also some examples in the book where it was the fact that it was a local person managing the relationship that ended up becoming a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So in the case of ICTJ, in Aceh, I think the politics between local activists is very, complex.
Mm-hmm.
And when a local activist is hired by an international NGO to manage a project, sometimes you end up with those tensions within local civil society then playing out in the relationship between the international and the local. So yes, it can work really well. It can also end up backfiring in a way that wouldn't happen if you had an outsider.
Yeah. And that's why in those two contexts, that's why we do have internationals. The political context in both of those countries, and I suppose the lack of political space that there is in Cambodia, and there has always been in Myanmar, even though it's, there's been a lot of progress made in a relatively short period of time. You need the space. I know I think we're ready for a command national director when the current director leaves. But yeah, I think it depends a little bit too. It's on the politics, like you're saying, whether that's national level politics or whether it's local level politics. Where do you need someone to give you a bit of a steer who's not involved? So yeah, contextual, I suppose, is where it all comes down to.
So I have another question about, thinking about those different forms of partnership that you were describing, and both of you talked about how context was really important. I imagine that also you have your values and ideas about partnership, but then you're also very reliant on the money and how these partnerships are going to be funded. So how do you balance your values and your ideals about how to work with people against what you're expected to do and produce by your donors?
Yeah, it's tricky, firstly. Depending on who the donor is. We've been able to get around it somehow, I think, with DFAT. No one from DFAT being in the room. I think if you're clever, you can work out a way where you achieve your objectives, with a partnership and in a program, while at the same time fulfilling a government's objectives. But that does get, I think you could end up in a situation. I've been there before, not with Action Aid, not yet, but it'll probably happen at some point where there's a rush on to spend a lot of money. You've got to really cram activities into the back end of the year so you get next tranche. There's not much flexibility, and that gets tricky. I think particularly disturbing in this space at the moment is performance-based contracts that are probably coming our way relatively soon. DFID is already rolling those out. So if you're not delivering the outputs that you need to deliver at each quarter, you don't get the next tranche of money. So there's also, really you've got to cut down on the quality of your work to be able to get the next chunk of money. Most of our work internationally is funded through child sponsorship. And this is still a relatively new area for me, and it's not something we really focus on selling, on the street in Australia and, connecting supporters that way so much. Probably got a bit more to say about that than I would, but I think, I came into Action Aid as a critic of child sponsorship, like many people are. But what I've seen, and we have a regular conversation, all you need to do is mention the word child sponsorship in the staff meeting and you're going to be there for a while. Everyone has a view. But what it does do is it gives the continuity of funding, because people, when they come on board and sponsor a child, they're usually there somewhere between 7 to 10 years. There's a connection in place. So most of the local rights programs that we work in, local area programs, we stay for 10 years. And that work has a constant funding stream that's provided through the link between the supporter in Australia and the child. So in a sense, the money's not that big an issue. you're more concerned about, well, what's actually going on in this community? What does this community need? How can the community have agency to make their own decisions about what they want to do, which is almost at the core of this. And that funding source, I've been really surprised actually. And when we talk to, we have the conversation, I'm sure ChildFund had them as well, as far as the split, how much of the money stays in the community, how much is can be allocated for, say, national level advocacy and campaigning, and a lot of the old timers in Action Aid will always say, keep it on the ground. Don't let the money move to national campaigns, because that's where we really get our impact. So, yeah, I think it depends on the funding modality. Government funding can be a bit tricky, and there are elements that are a bit easier.
So here's the tension that I see on this. For me, and I think for ChildFund, the best partnerships are partnerships are best where it's more like a network situation. So for us, as we're learning in Myanmar, which is our real laboratory for learning about working only with civil society, the ideal model for us there is not to have staff in country. And so we work as a network with organizations and carry out things, supporting them and have a real peer relationship, or eye to eye, as we used to call it at ESC. That would be really nice, and I think that's true. That's a true model. So the tension is, there's that, and then there's donor requirements, the point you bring up. So donor requirements have not turned out to be that big a problem. But you're pulled towards having your own staff. Why? Because you don't want to impose donor requirements on local partners. You could do that, they would probably accept it, but that transforms your relationship. So you end up pulling away from the idea of not having any staff in country to provide a service, to translate the donor requirements, to help the partners with their own systems and their own processes and build their capacity, and then do the work to translate that, to bridge that to the DFAT requirements or to whoever as a service. You're still, I think, fairly respectful of partnership by doing that. But you've introduced like the element of sabotage of the partner model by having your own staff present, because we all have egos, and that gets in the way. And those relationships, which are often really good, so that person has a husband, but the husband also has some people that he or she have relationships with, and so that complicates things. So in my view, better stay away. Provide a respectful distance and work that way. But to support the partners and to not impose DFAT requirements and others, you end up putting people in place to help. And that creates a tension with the best model of partnership, I think. And that's where we're at. We've got a small team now because we have to, in order to not impose stuff on the partners. And we have to be really careful about that, because we're all human beings with egos.
I think the last question that I wanted to put to both of you is around the question of power. And in these relationships, both of you work for organisations based in Australia or international organisations, and you come in with funding into these communities, and a lot of the organisations and individuals you work with are relying on this funding to be able to do things for their future. So that creates an interesting dynamic of power. How do you manage that? How do you manage that? How do you think about it, or how does it affect the way that you interact with people, maybe more as individuals rather than in terms of your organizational practices?
So I'm sure Archie will have a lot to say about this. ActionAid has thought about this for a decade and worked a lot with Robert Chambers on how to do all of this stuff really well. So I'll defer a lot of the how-to him. So from my perspective, in the 90s and this century, the Alan Fowler authentic partnership and all that, it's all been about power. And we've always said for these 20 years, that's the hard part, that's the tough part, right? That's where it goes wrong, where we because we've got money coming out of our pockets. When we walk into the room, we have automatically accrued power. And I think that's true, and there's a lot of work that's happened to try to set up structures, and structures that Archie talked about, to try to handle that and try to mitigate that situation. And it's never perfect, because there's some human nature in it. I think it's more about ego than money, but actually, I think it's still there. It's in the room. But I do think, again, just like I was saying before about network partnerships, I think the world is changing. I think that the idea of developed country international NGOs with power and swaggering into the room with money, that was true, and it's less and less true. Our countries, speaking for my view of the countries, developed countries, that's not where the action is anymore. We're weaker and weaker on the world stage. And a lot of the countries where we do program work are emerging. And you can feel that. People now, so I'll give you a quick example before I give the mic to Archie. I was a country director, fortunate enough to be a country director in Vietnam in the late 90s in Vietnam for Plan International. When I got to Vietnam, the staff, and I was the only expat, so that's a good thing, right? And very capable people, best I've worked with. The mantra was always, you're bringing international standards. Your job is to help us get there, get up to, and they were hungry for that, the staff, the local staff in Vietnam. So I go back there, because ChildFund works in Vietnam, I go back pretty regularly. And my successors and current country directors in Vietnam have a very different situation. They are no longer the shining example of solutions walking into the room. The Vietnamese are absolutely ready to have their own say about things. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I think that the power thing, to some extent, is being mitigated by the way the world's going. And so I just trying to be a tiny bit provocative here, I do think it's going to be less of a problem, because we, developed country people, more and more don't have as much power as we think, as we used to.
Yeah, I think it's almost, what do they say, the globalisation paradox, like the more globalised the world becomes, at the same time the more countries are exerting their sovereignty, particularly in the humanitarian recovery space as well. Governments don't want foreign governments funded entities running around doing whatever they want to do. And there's a big knock-on from that, and that has huge implications, particularly in the humanitarian sphere. The whole power issue, I don't know how right we get it, but we grapple with it a lot. Had more conversations about power in ActionAid than I've had anywhere else, that's for sure. It's the whole notion of our rights-based approach and how we work is all based on power, but it's all based on giving people who are living in poverty, exclusion, deprivation, how do we give them power? How are they able to get power? And it really builds a lot on the work of Freire and Marx about people enabling themselves to have an understanding of the reasons why they're living as they are, and then working on how do we get people working together at community level and beyond community level in solidarity, and ultimately how are they challenging the power, which is usually a duty bearer like a government, and then how do they hold that government to account for delivering the services and entitlements that they are entitled to by virtue of being human. That sort of 2-minute snapshot is at the base of everything we do. And that, it's interesting actually, that engages the whole organisation. So everyone will talk about that approach. You'll hear pretty much the same version every country I go to, whether it's at a national level or a community level, you'll hear a version of that. And everything is about how do we give people power, how we enable people to have power. It's not like we have power to give, but how are people able to actually pick that up? So in a sense, that almost becomes your mission. And when it's your mission, you're really looking at how do other people build power rather than how do we exercise it. And that doesn't mean, we're perfect or anything like that. We have the same challenges that Mark describes, where people probably think, well, I've got to get something done. And that's where the questions have to come out. Well, that's going to take some time, because ultimately, what are we here to do? And how do we enable people to transform and change lives, which is always around the issue of power. And I suppose maybe just to wind up too, I think that's always the interesting question, I think, with any organisation in this space, whether it's international, national or whatever, it's like, how are you working on the power issue? And you get a good sense of who's where and how they respond to that question.
I think it's an interesting question for a lot of us academics working in Southeast Asia as well. And there's money involved in research. There's different opportunities for academics in Australia to Southeast Asia. So yes, it's an important question. We have a bit of time now to take questions from the floor. If anyone wants to ask questions of Archie or Mike or me, go ahead. Yes.
My name is Albert. When you working in NGO, maybe the most challenging for you when people ask you about accountability, because you have a different responsibility between the community and government. And for us in Indonesia, we have found difficulties how to explain the accountability, because if we explain the accountability to the community, this is the accountability, but for the government, the accountability is given, and for the academicians, they have also put a different meaning for the accountability. So for the NGO, maybe as my friends have a different answer, how you will answer if the different stakeholders ask you a question, how you accountable to your projects. That's the question.
Do you take a couple?
Maybe we'll take a couple, yeah. Peter.
My name's Peter Jennings. Just to you, Archie, just reflecting on what you were talking about power then. In the East Timor situation, the Timor-Leste, we have a very, if you like, a very unpleasant power structure between the Australian government and the Timorese government over the oil and gas. Like at the moment, the Australian government and Australian NGOs give about $500,000 a day to Timor-Leste. At the same time, we take about $1 million a day of their oil and gas. And while we in Australia are generally ignorant of this, because many Australians don't understand the whole issue of the median line and for the border, in Timor, they're very aware of it, right down to the most remote village. And I know our partners up there are really strong on this issue and very incensed by it. And it's something that's annoying them and eating at them day after day. So would you like to perhaps reflect a little bit on the power struggle, the power situation, government v government, and what we in Australia as ordinary people could be doing about it?
And maybe we'll take one more question and anyone else? Yes. Yeah.
Nick Woodland from Department of Media and Communications. I guess returning to the idea of power and particularly focused on funding, I did some work recently with USAID, and one of the issues that they're grappling with is targets around funding for local NGOs. And I think from memory, I was quite surprised, it's something like only 10% of USAID funds is actually spent on local NGOs. So we feel we've come so far in sort of our partnerships and our power relations, but we're still at sort of 10%. And I think they've set a target now to spend 15% by 2020, which is still an extraordinarily sort of low number. So I'm wondering, do you see that as a sort of a trend that's going to increase towards, especially with these issues of accountability and sort of assertiveness coming out of our partner countries? And do you hear of any of that actually coming out of DFAT here in terms of whether or not we're going to start spending more or setting targets?
Yeah, maybe on accountability, I mean, I suppose there's multiple levels of accountability, as I think this is what you're saying. There's accountability within a community, there's accountability with an NGO or a CPO, and then accountability with governments as well. I think it's more about the conversation of who's accountable for what to who. So what are we accountable for when we form a partnership with a CBO, and what relationship, what accountabilities are there? What's the role of the government in providing the services to communities? How are they accountable to communities? And how are communities accountable to people in the community as well, to ensure that everyone enjoys the benefits when they come. So it's all, we need Chris Roach in the room actually. Because Chris is really the specialist on all of this, but it's all, those loops of accountability that are built in. But often that's a difficult conversation to have with the government too. And one of my favourite moments of the year, given we're in November, was a visit with the Australian High Commissioner in Kenya to a rural community, and they had women smallholder farmers, and the governor came with us as well, with all of his people. So it was one of those 15 cars on the road sort of shows. And they showed him around, the High Commissioner around a few farms, and showed him stuff, if you like. And then they said, is there anything that the women would like to say? And the woman stepped forward and she said, I'd like to direct my remarks to the Governor. And she said, we need more support from your office, because you have small grants that you're meant to give us, but they're very complex bureaucratically, and we don't know how to make those work. So we need simplicity in how we access money. We need support from you as far as irrigation techniques go and new technology. You're meant to be doing that. You're not doing that at the moment. She's incredibly brave. And in terms of having the courage to stand up and say to the power, this is what I'm entitled to, this is my rights. I think that's, you see that in action, it's very inspiring. Maybe just briefly, I think what you're saying as far as Timor and the Australian role in Timor, I mean, this is probably the problem with aid, if you like, as well. That you could look at aid as a little bit of a band-aid in some ways, where you have the structural conditions in place, whether it's something like the treaty, the Timor Gap, where Australia's manipulated that in such a way that all the benefits come down here really rather than stay there. So in a sense, you're screwing the money out of a country and its people in that way, and then you give them a little bit of foreign aid on the side, because that maybe makes you feel better. It makes you feel like you're doing something. And you can look at any country, I think, and see examples of that. And that's one of the big challenges in Australia. How do we mobilise Australians in campaigning with our own government for that sort of change? Because until those structural conditions are lifted, whether it be there or Australia's role in the Cairns Group, we're not going to see the elimination of the inequality, of the deprivation, of the marginalisation. We'll just keep getting band-aids put on the problems. I think that's almost the centre of it. Just briefly on the local NGOs, it's always seen as a nice thing to do, if you like. 10 to 15%, that doesn't surprise as far as about that. But there's glimmers of hope around the place. There's some really interesting, we've just started some research. Again, it's humanitarian space, but the role of local actors in humanitarian response. And we know that there's huge ground to be covered in there, and particularly in that world where it's very much dominated by people who look like me. And there's an increased awareness that that's not working. So where are the local actors in there? But I don't know, I don't see any specific change. And it's interesting, I've been a bit of a critic of the sector here in Australia. You know, a lot of the conversation is around what percentage of the Australian aid budget goes to organisations like ours. I don't think I've heard someone actually raise the issue of what percentage of that budget goes to local organisations. And maybe that's an issue with the maturity of the sector here too, as far as, you know, how much do we focus on the outcome rather than focusing on ourselves.
Just to follow up on that, in the previous government, with AusAid and then DFAT under the previous government, one did hear a desire, a commitment to increase the direct engagement between DFAT, AusAid and local organizations outside of Australia as being a great thing, and let's do it. I haven't heard that under the new government. I don't think it's part of the new aid policy, and I haven't heard it. It could be, but I haven't heard it. Even so, it's hard. It's always been hard for me to imagine a bilateral of the size of AusAid or USAID interacting really with a local organization. It's always been a lot with the scale and the kind of pressures they have to manage their overheads. I've always thought that our organizations, sooner or later, there'll be some specialists and there'll be brokers. There'll be organizations that know how to do that partnership work, and that could be where we could add value, but I don't hear it under the new government very much. To the Indonesia colleague with accountability, just to give an example, our organization has a pretty good approach to this. So just to give you a brief flavor, every 3 years we do a survey of how things are in areas that matter to us and our partners. Those surveys are then taken to community discussions, and where we talk about outputs that have been produced by ChildFund and other actors, including government, during those 3 years. Government participates in those discussions, as do other NGOs. Through those discussions of the change of high-level outcome indicators, we talk about attribution of those changes to different actors. Who has contributed, and to whom could we attribute these changes? And then we have a discussion of all the activities that have gone on, and I think that's a good example of transparency and accountability. All of the activities are put on the table. Case studies of qualitative change are on the table. Hard data, including government data on changes. Okay, now how can we improve that? So that's one element of accountability. And the kind of event that Archie was talking about, which ActionAid is very good at, of communities actually speaking to duty bearers, is part of our approach also. So you'll see organized groups of youth, excluded youth, getting together to influence the planning at local level in Cambodia. Really exciting examples of accountability of government that our kind of organization can help promote, and it's different in different countries. So I think there are other levels of transparency and accountability, but just to speak to the operational level, we try to be very accountable and actually work with these community groups to process that information. So we've got a statement of impact that is meant to be the voice of communities. It's not us talking about the impact of our work. It's the communities have gotten together over a period of time, community leaders, government leaders, local NGOs, talking about what has ChildFund accomplished and not accomplished. What have we done wrong in this area? So it's a mechanism we've got.
Yep, well, I think we might round it off there, but before finishing up, I just wanted to touch on this question of accountability. It was a big one in the book, but just in terms of how local organisations are accountable to their international partners. And one of the things that was really interesting was the strategies that local NGOs use to get around some of the accountability mechanisms that their international partners required of them. So my favourite story was of a local NGO that found out that the donor found out, the international NGO found out that the local community were siphoning off a little bit of money that had been given to them to build a basketball court. And the local NGO discovered that this was going on and found out that the international NGO was thinking of pulling the project. And he knew, the guy who ran this NGO knew that if the project was pulled, it would have the complete opposite outcome of what the international NGO wanted. It would create a lot more conflict in that community because this basketball court, which had been promised to them, wouldn't have happened. So this local NGO actually, the owner, the director of this local NGO actually pulled money out of his own pocket and gave it back to the international NGO just to make sure that the project ran more smoothly. So anyway, just a little anecdote to round off our very interesting discussion tonight. Thanks both of you for being part of it, and thanks all of you for coming along tonight. And I suppose I should mention that if you're interested in a copy of the book, we've got, Palgrave have provided a sort of a flyer which will allow you to order the book for a discounted price this evening. So if you want to order one, Mariko's got the forms over there. Fill in your details and we'll post it off for you. Thanks again, and have another drink. I think there's still a little bit of time before we wrap up.